I ordered a child to be cut in half. Not as a metaphor, not as a pedagogical test for the court to watch in admiration. A real sword. A real child. An order spoken aloud, without hesitation, before the entire tribunal. And the story that reached you calls it wisdom. It wasn't. It was a gamble. I was betting a baby's life on my ability to read human instinct faster than a lie can organize itself. If I was wrong, and there was a real chance I was, that child would have died. And the people would never have known what really happened in that room, because no one asked me the right question. No one asked, what if she hadn't reacted? There is something else no one told you. The two women who entered my tribunal were zonot. The Hebrew word is in the text, chapter 3, verse 16. Prostitutes. Which meant there was not a single possible witness. None. No husband, no father, no neighbor who could testify about the workings of that house. Any just tribunal, using available methods, would have declared the case unresolvable. What I did was not test love. It was forcing the body to speak when the mouth had no options left. And it worked. And that was the beginning of the problem. Before continuing, this voice is a reconstruction. I am Solomon reassembled by artificial intelligence from what he himself left written. The books of Kings, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs. Where I go beyond the text, I will say so. The rest is what the facts allow us to imagine. Now, pay attention. Have you ever used your intelligence to justify a decision that, deep down, you knew you shouldn't make? Tell me in the comments. I'm reading. You grew up hearing this story. The wise king, the baby, the sword, the mother who gives up her own child to save him. A beautiful story. Clean. The kind of story that goes into the book and stays there forever. Well-behaved, with its moral built in and everything resolved. That is not what happened in that room. What happened was stranger, colder, more disturbing than the version you were told. Because I was not testing anyone's love. There was no wisdom script I was executing to impress the court. There was no pedagogy. I was listening. And what I wanted to hear was not their voices. It was what the body says when the mouth has no options left. But to understand what happened in that room, you need to understand who was sitting on that throne. I had just inherited the kingdom from my father, not the way stories tell it, the beloved son assuming power with pomp and ceremony, while the old king smiles in satisfaction. My father had been dying for months, unable to stay warm even beneath blankets. And while he was dying, my older brother Adonijah summoned the generals, the priests, the king's sons, and declared himself king without anyone's permission. A feast, sacrifices, public acclamation. My name had not been mentioned. My mother walked into my father's room and said what needed to be said. The prophet Nathan confirmed it. And my father, from the bed where he could barely sit up, gave the order. They anointed me at Gihon, set me upon the royal mule, and the people shouted so loud the earth shook. Adonijah heard the celebration while still at his own celebration. He ran to seize the horns of the altar. I assumed the throne over the echo of an attempted coup. The months that followed were blood and cleanup. Joab, the most powerful general in Israel, executed at the very altar to which he had fled. Shimei, killed by the word he himself had given. Adonijah, killed for a petition that was, at its core, a second attempt to take what was not his. I was probably under 20 years old, when everything went quiet, when the bodies had been buried and power had been consolidated. The text says something most people read too quickly. And the kingdom was established in Solomon's hands. established, as if firmness comes without cost. Before Gibeon, before the dream, before anything you associate with my name, there was one thing I had already done. I had married Pharaoh's daughter. Political alliance, border sealing, stability for a young and vulnerable kingdom. That is what I would have said if you asked. And I wouldn't have been lying. They were real, verifiable, strategically sound reasons. But there was a law. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 3 to 4. Clear, direct. You shall not intermarry with them, for they will turn your sons away from following me. There was no ambiguity. There was an explicit warning about exactly what would happen, described with surgical precision centuries in advance. I read the law. I married anyway. Not out of ignorance, out of a conviction that had not yet revealed its dangerous nature. The conviction that I understood the exceptions better than the rules. That there was context the law had not anticipated. That I was capable of navigating between the sacred and the pragmatic without getting lost in either. That conviction did not yet have a name. Later it would. The dream at Gibeon came after that. God appeared in the night, not with thunder, not with apocalyptic vision. Simply, ask what you wish me to give you. I woke and knew it had not been an ordinary dream. There was a different weight in the morning air, a density that did not belong to that room, as if the space had been filled with something, and the something was still partially there. The smell of incense from the previous evening's sacrifices still rested on the cold stone walls of Gibeon. And for a moment, before I moved, I lay still, feeling the weight of what had been asked. I asked for one thing. Give your servant a hearing heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. Not wealth, not victory over enemies, not long life. The capacity to hear what a situation is really saying, beneath what people are saying. God said yes. He said more than yes. He said there had never been, nor would there ever be, another like me. It is written. I am not exaggerating. But promise is not proof, and I still had no proof. The kingdom was consolidated on paper. My father's men obeyed me because the chain of command required it. No one had yet seen whether there was anything real behind the title. Then the two women walked in. They arrived early in the morning. I remember the sound they made, not the crying, but the footsteps. Two pairs of sandals on the stone floor, one pair behind the other, and between them the hostile silence of those who had spent the entire night accusing each other. The air inside the hall was heavy, laden with sweat and something older. The anger of those who have lost something they cannot prove they had. The text is direct about who they were. Zonot, in Hebrew. Prostitutes. Not metaphorically, not as the narrator's insult, as a description of social reality. And that reality meant something precise for what was about to happen. There were no possible witnesses. None. No husband, father, neighbor who could testify about the routine of that house. It was the nature of the work, discreet, nocturnal, closed. Two babies born days apart in the same room with no other presence. The law of Moses had not anticipated this specific scenario. Any just tribunal using available methods would have declared the case unresolvable. I heard both stories. The first woman spoke without looking at the second. The second interrupted before the first had finished. The voices rose. The room began to resonate with accusation and counter-accusation until the noise became an indistinct mass of pain and lies mixed together in a way that was impossible to separate by ear. Each said the same thing. The living child is mine. And each seemed to believe what she was saying. I sat watching them. The men around me waited. There were protocols for this. Lot casting, ordeal, referral to the priests. declaring the case unsolvable and spreading the responsibility among the city elders. There were ways of not deciding without appearing to flee the decision. I was not thinking about any of them. I was thinking about what I had asked for at Gibeon, a hearing heart. And I was thinking that hearing does not mean listening to words. It means reaching what lies beneath the words, the instinct, the place where lies cannot dwell because it is too fast for conscious control. There was a way to get there. It was brutal. It was the kind of thing that, if I were wrong in my reading, would destroy everything. The child, the judgment, the trust of a people in a 20-year-old king who had assumed the throne over fresh corpses. There was no plan B. There was no signal I could give the officer to quietly stand down if things went wrong. There was only the order. And there was my conviction that I had read human instinct correctly. I looked at the officer beside me. "Bring me a sword." The word left my mouth and the room stopped. Not from fear. It stopped the way the air stops before a storm. That second when the world suspends its judgment and waits to see if it's really going to happen. The guards looked at one another. The officer to my right stood still for too long before moving his feet. I did not repeat the order. It wasn't necessary. When a king must repeat an order, he has already lost half the authority the order was meant to carry. The sword arrived. Cold. Long. The metal caught the torchlight and threw an orange stripe across the stone ceiling. The officer held it with both hands, palms up, like someone offering, not threatening. He did not know what I was going to do with it. No one did, including, I suspected, the two women. Divide the living child in two. Give half to one and half to the other. Now you will ask me, what passes through a man's mind when he pronounces those words over a living child? I will tell you exactly. I was not feeling anything resembling cruelty. That is what is difficult to explain. Cruelty has a specific texture, warm, expansive, the crooked satisfaction of someone who delights in power over another being. What I felt was the opposite, a functional coldness, the absolute concentration of someone executing a calculation with zero margin of error. Like a surgeon who must cut to heal and cannot afford to feel the cut while making it. But there was something beneath that coldness, something I was not allowing myself to examine in that moment. I was betting a life, not metaphorically. There was a child in that room, in the arms of the woman who had spoken first, small, dark-haired, with the warm breath babies have when they sleep. And I had given an order that, if my reading were wrong, would result in her death. There was no plan B. There was no signal I could give the officer to quietly stand down if things got out of hand. There was only the order. And there was my conviction that I had read human instinct correctly. What I was testing was not love. Love is what both could perform. Love is words, tears, gestures. And liars are, by definition, skilled at emotional performance. What I was testing was the nervous system's response in the millisecond before conscious choice. A mother's protective instinct does not pass through reasoning. There is no deliberation between the danger and the impulse to protect. The body reacts before the mind can fabricate a calculated version of the reaction. That was what I needed to see. I needed it to happen so fast that the lie would have no time to dress itself as truth. The silence after the order lasted perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds is an eternity when you are waiting to find out if you were right. And then came the cry. It was not weeping. It was not an elaborate plea. It was a sound that came from somewhere deeper than words reach. The place where the body stores what it cannot name. The woman who had spoken first folded herself over the child in her arms as if covering a wound, and what came out of her mouth was, "O my Lord, give her the living child, and do not kill her." The other said, "Let it be neither mine nor yours. Divided." In that fraction of a second between the two sounds, between the absolute surrender of one and the calculated indifference of the other, I knew. There was no doubt, no margin for interpretation. The first woman's body had spoken before she could give me anything I could question. The second had confirmed what I suspected. When there was nothing left to gain, the mask fell, and beneath the mask was someone who preferred destruction to the public testimony of her own defeat. Give the child to the first woman. Do not kill her. She is the mother. The room erupted. I remember the noise, the kind of collective reaction that rises spontaneously without organization when a group of people witnesses something that exceeds the category of event and enters the category of revelation. The text says that all Israel heard, and that they feared the king, because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Feared. That is the word the text uses. Not admired, not celebrated. Feared. I understood why. What no one asked me, what no one ever asks when they tell this story, is what remained after the room emptied. The child had been saved. The mother had walked out with her. The people had witnessed. The kingdom had received the proof it needed that there was something real behind the title. And I sat on that throne of ivory and gold with a question that had not been invited, but that had entered anyway and had no intention of leaving soon. What if she hadn't reacted? Not the false woman, the real one. What if the true mother, exhausted from a night of grief and accusation, and an entire morning of legal battle she was losing, had remained silent for 1 second too long? What if trauma had frozen her before instinct could emerge? What if she had calculated that perhaps the other woman wouldn't really let the order be carried out, and that the best move was to wait? I had bet a child's life on the speed of a maternal reflex, and I had won. But winning is not the same as being certain you were right in the method. And that distinction, the difference between the correct outcome and the justifiable method, was the first crack in something I could not yet see whole. The kingdom grew, peace on the borders. The temple built, stone upon stone in 7 years, with materials my father had accumulated and plans God had given. The Queen of Sheba came from a distance men measured in months of travel, not days. And when she left, she said that the reality had surpassed what she had been told. 700 royal wives, 300 concubines. Each arrived with an alliance, with a stabilized border, with a treaty that protected Israel on a different flank. I had reasons. I always had reasons. And my reasons were, almost always, verifiable and strategically correct. The law said not to multiply wives because they would turn my heart away. I had read the law. I knew the mechanism it described. And I had concluded, not with arrogance but with the seriousness of someone who had thought deeply, that I was capable of navigating that risk in a way others were not. I had saved a baby by betting on my capacity for reading. I had built the temple of God. I had administered the greatest period of prosperity Israel had ever seen. What reason did I have to believe that capacity had limits? The cost did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way erosion arrives, invisible in a day, devastating over a decade. An altar here, to Ashtoreth for a Phoenician wife who had asked with genuine tenderness and eyes I could not deny. A shrine there, to Chemosh, the abominable god of Moab. Each concession had a face, each face had a story, and I had become too skilled at finding the story that justified the concession. God appeared to me twice, not only in a dream, in direct encounter. And still I continued. That is what the text says. Still. The external cost is documented. The kingdom divided after my death, 10 tribes torn from my lineage, given to my servant because I had not kept what I had promised. My son Rehoboam lost more in 1 week than I had built in 40 years. But the internal cost was different. It was quieter, and it cost me more. I lost the capacity to be surprised by my own wisdom. When you are the wisest man in the world, by divine declaration, not by vanity, and that wisdom protects you from nothing, what remains? What do you do with a gift that did not fulfill its implicit promise to save you from yourself? I wrote about it. It's all there. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. In Hebrew, hebel habalim, vapor of vapors. Not philosophy, not preaching. Confession. I have pursued everything that wisdom permitted pursuing and riches permitted buying. Wisdom, pleasure, works, property, music, wines, gardens, reservoirs. It's all on the list, with the detail of someone who actually did everything. And at the end of the list, the conclusion no man with pride wants to write about his own life. And I looked at all the works my hands had made, and at the labor I had labored to do. And behold, all was vanity and grasping after wind. That is not a theologian concluding a thesis. That is a man who reached the end of himself and had enough honesty to write down what he found there. There is one thing I learned that is not in the book of Proverbs. It is not in any of my 3,000 proverbs, not in the songs, not in the descriptions of cedars and hyssop and fish and serpents that men came from distant nations to hear. It is in Ecclesiastes, hidden in the middle of all the disenchantment, in a sentence most people read too quickly, because what comes before is heavy, and what comes after is heavier still. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every hidden work, whether good or evil. I did not write that as a threat, not as a warning for others. I wrote it as the only fixed point I found after everything else had proven to be vapor. When you pursue everything and discover that everything is empty, you need an anchor, or you sink. And the only anchor that remained was the idea that there is a structure that does not depend on my ability to read it correctly, that it exists even when I err, that it does not collapse when my interpretation collapses. I had built my entire life on the conviction that my reading was the foundation. It was not. Let me tell you what really happened in that room on the day of the baby. Not what the text says, the text you can read. What happened beneath what the text says. A young king with an unproven gift entered an impossible case and used the only tool he had. His ability to read what lies beneath what people show. It worked. The baby was saved. The lie was exposed. Justice was done. And the young king left that room with a certainty that had been proven correct, and for that reason was never questioned again. That certainty was, I can see what others cannot see, and that gives me the right to operate outside the restrictions that exist for those who cannot see. I didn't formulate it that way. I never verbalized it. But it was there, growing with each confirmed decision, each alliance that worked, each wife who arrived with a valid treaty and a face that seemed reasonable in the context of the geopolitical strategy of the moment. The wisdom that should have protected me became the most refined instrument of my own destruction. Because intelligence, without submission to something greater than itself, does not build, it justifies. And it justifies with a sophistication that ignorance could never reach. An ignorant man makes obvious mistakes. A very intelligent man makes mistakes that seem, at the moment of decision, not only reasonable, but necessary, inevitable, superior to the alternatives. I did not err by failing to think. I erred by thinking too much, finding the right reasons to do the wrong thing. Now the mirror. I am not speaking to a king. I am speaking to someone who has something: intelligence, talent, position, the ability to read people, analytical capacity, charm, strategic vision. Something that works, that has already been proven, that others recognize and sometimes fear a little, the same way the people feared me after the baby. And that thing that works, it was used to justify some decision that you knew, at some level you don't usually visit, you should not have made. I'm not talking about a grotesque mistake. It doesn't have to be. I'm talking about the first small concession you rationalized because the context was special, because you understood nuances the rule had not anticipated, because there were real reasons, and they were real reasons, that made this situation different from the situations for which the original guideline had been written. And it worked. Then came the second, with a different set of equally real reasons, and the 10th, and the 15th. And somewhere between the 1st and the 15th, you stopped asking whether you were doing the right thing, and began only finding reasons for what you had already decided to do. That is not weakness, not stupidity. It is what happens to intelligent people who use their intelligence as a foundation instead of a tool. A foundation is what holds everything up. A tool is what you use to build on the foundation. When the tool occupies the place of the foundation, the building still stands for a while, especially if the tool is good, but not indefinitely. I built a temple. I built an empire of peace. I wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. And in the end, I wrote that everything was vapor. The temple lasted. I did not. I returned to the baby, saved. Somewhere in Israel, that child grew up, perhaps had children, perhaps heard the story of the king who ordered a child divided, and understood, by having been that child, what no second-hand listener understands, that it had been a gamble, that someone had put her life on the table and had read human instinct correctly. That was real. That day was real. The wisdom that worked in that courtroom was real. And what came after was also real. There is no version of this story where I choose one. I am both. The king who saved the baby, and the man who built altars to gods he had promised never to serve. And the distance between the two is not an incomprehensible mystery. It is a trajectory, a logical progression step by step, each step justified, each justification slightly more sophisticated than the one before. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, not the end, the beginning. Wisdom that has God as its foundation is different from wisdom that has itself as its foundation. I knew the difference. I had started in the right place. I left. Not all at once, gradually. Concession by concession, reason by reason, altar by altar. I left the place where wisdom serves the foundation and entered the place where wisdom is the foundation. And then I discovered, too late to rebuild what had been surrendered, that a foundation made of intelligence cannot bear the weight that life places upon it.